Welcome back to the Trinity Channel. My name is Dr. Tony Costa, and I'm glad that you could join us today. We were dealing in our former episode with the question of investigating the Quran. We're looking at some parallels in the Quran that conflict with one another. And we were talking in our last segment about Surah 234, the story of the angels being ordered by Allah to prostrate themselves before Adam, and also how Iblis, the devil, refused to do so, and how this story appears in 7 different places within the Quran. And last time we were together, we looked at Surah 2 and verse 34, where Allah commands the angels to perform sujud, prostrating. We talked about how sujud is a word that is usually associated with worship. And here we seem to have a very strange story of Allah endorsing shirk, asking the angels to do something by associating Adam as a partner, so it would seem, with Allah, which would be the essence of shirk itself. And we also saw in Surah 234 how that Iblis seems to be among the angels, which is a very strange thing, because in the Quran, in Islamic theology, the devil is the jinn, and the angels are not the same. And yet, we're told in Surah 18, verse 50, that Iblis was of the jinn, that is, he was of the order of the jinn, which are not angels or men. Now, we're going to continue on our slides. We're looking at Surah 7, verses 11 to 18. We're going to continue where we left off. And in this second part of the story, we're told there that Iblis responds to Allah and says, the reason why he did not worship or perform prostration, he says, I am better than him. Thou createst me of fire, while thou didst create him, that is, Adam, of mud. And Allah asks Iblis, what hindered thee that thou didst not fall prostrate when I bade thee? And so you will notice here that here you actually have a dialogue between Allah and Iblis that you did not see in Surah 234. Now, if we move on and we look at our next slide, and we look at Surah 15 and verses 28 to 43, you will notice here in this that the response or the command that Allah gives to Iblis is again very different than what we just saw in Surah 7. And here we're told in Surah 15, verse 32, O Iblis, what aileth thee that thou art not among the prostrate? That is not what we saw in Surah 7. We have a completely different saying here. And Iblis responds in Surah 15, verse 33. He said, I am not one to prostrate myself unto a mortal whom thou hast created out of potter's clay of black mud altered. Now notice again in this story that the statement of Allah differs from that we saw in Surah 7, 11 to 18. Unlike the other passages, Allah announces to the angels that He will create a mortal out of potter's clay of black mud altered, and that He would also breathe His Spirit into the man. You see that in Surah 15, verses 28 to 29. And remember when thy Lord said unto the angels, Lo, I am creating a mortal out of potter's clay of black mud altered. So when I've made him and have breathed into him of my Spirit, do ye fall down, prostrating yourselves unto him. And so here in this story, we see how Allah breathes His Spirit into Adam. Now, if we move on and we look at the next passage, that is in Surah 17 and verses 61 to 65, you will notice here that the response that Iblis gives to Allah is different again. You'll notice that after Allah gives Iblis the command to prostrate himself with the angels to Adam, you'll notice here that Iblis responds and he says, shall I prostrate before that which thou hast created of clay? Now notice here that the response that Iblis gives to Allah again is different. So what are we seeing so far? What we're seeing in these stories is that we have the same event that's being recast, but that the dialogue between Allah and Iblis, and even the command and the description of the events are not being told the same way. And what do we do with these differences? Well, if we move on to the next slide, you'll notice that in Surah 18 and verse 50, we have this story being recounted again, but in this account, in Surah 18, verse 50 of the Quran, there is no dialogue recorded between Allah and Iblis, as in the other parallel passages. It's a description. It describes what happened, and it describes that upon giving the order to prostrate to Adam, Iblis refuses to do so, and it is here in this passage that Iblis is said to be of the jinn. He is clearly distinguished here from the angels, whereas in Surah 2, verse 34, Iblis is associated, it is implied that he is one of the angels. Now, why do we have all these differences? Have you ever wondered why these differences exist, why these parallel accounts seem to be conflicting with one another? Is it possible that the Quran came together from various sources? Is it possible that what we have is the same story being recounted by different collectors or compilers of the Quran? Again, if we look at the next text in Surah 20 and verses 116 to 123, you will notice here that there is no address at all from Allah to Iblis. There is no dialogue between Allah and Iblis. In this passage in Surah 2, verses 116 to 23, Allah simply warns Adam and Eve about Iblis, or about the devil. He warns them about the devil. In this story, you actually have Iblis, or the devil, speaking to Adam and seeking to tempt him. And the dialogue between Iblis and Adam in this text also differs from the parallel in Surah 7, verse 20. You notice here that this story in this particular passage is unique in that we're told what the devil or Iblis was actually saying to Adam. And then when we look at the final series here, the final passage in our series, in Surah 38 and verses 71 to 77, you'll notice that some interesting differences pop up in this passage as well. So here in this surah, you'll notice that it says, "When thy Lord said unto the angels, Lo, I am about to create a mortal out of mire." Now notice here that the mortal, or the human, or Adam, is said to be created out of mire, not of clay or of mud, but in this case, the word here is mire. It's a different word that is being used here. But also notice that the address of Allah to Satan, or to Iblis, is different from what we read in the other passages. Notice it says here from Surah 38 and verse 75, "He said, O Iblis, what hindereth thee from falling prostrate before that which I have created with both my hands?" Now notice here in this text, Allah speaks about his hands. He speaks about creating Adam with his hands, something that we did not see in the other accounts. So notice again, it's the same account, it's the same event, but it's being reported differently in various parts of the Quran. And this is only one example out of a group of other texts and stories that relate the same account, but relate it differently. Now I want you to also notice that the response that Iblis gives to Allah here, while it is similar to Surah 7, verses 11 to 18, is also different. Notice the response that Iblis gives in Surah 38 and verse 76. He said, "I am better than him." That is, I am better than Adam. I am better than the mortal. "Thou createst me of fire, while him thou createst out of clay." Now, my Muslim friends, what are we going to do with these differences in the Quran? The Quran claims to be sent down, tanzil, from Allah. The Quran claims to be mubin, that it's clear. Well, if the Quran is clear, then why is it that Iblis is spoken of in Surah 234 as being among the angels, and then in Surah 18 verse 50 he is said to be one of the jinn? And why is it that the responses of Iblis are different in these accounts? Why is it that the address of Allah to Iblis is different? Did Iblis say all of this at the same time? And what do we do when we hear the Muslim charge that because the Bible contains events in the New Testament Gospels, they retell the events differently and therefore they cannot be inspired? Do we apply the same criteria to the Quran? You see, the problem, folks, is the Quran is said to have come through one man, that is Muhammad, revealed to him. And even though Muslims don't believe that he wrote the Quran, they believe that various scribes wrote it and then it was compiled under various caliphs. The Quran faces a major problem because it was written during the same time period and it was given through one particular man. But you see, the Gospel accounts, which come 600 years before Islam, the Gospel accounts are understandable when we read accounts that are relating the same event, but they relate it differently, and that's simply because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written to 4 different audiences. And as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were addressing 4 different audiences, they were free and at liberty to arrange their materials that were germane to their audiences. And so Matthew wrote his gospel to the Jews, and you'll notice in Matthew's gospel, Matthew quotes from the Old Testament, profusely from the Old Testament, and he addresses a very Jewish context. Mark writes to presumably a Roman audience, and Mark has to define certain Jewish practices, which would indicate that his audience was not familiar with Judaism or Jewish practices. In other words, the gospel accounts are relating the same story, but they are framing them towards their particular audiences. And so naturally, of course, we would expect to see accounts being related in a different manner. If I'm writing to a certain audience that may be foreign from my culture, I'm not going to relate the same story as I would to people of my culture or people who are familiar with my language and so forth. And so it is understandable why the gospel accounts would be written and why there would be differences, simply because they're written to different audiences. But this does not pose a problem for New Testament believers. This does seem to pose a very serious problem with the Quran, because we're not talking about the author of the Quran or the authors of the Quran addressing different audiences. It was given in Arabic to an Arabic-speaking people, and it was given, according to Islamic tradition, during a 23-year period in which the Quran was believed to have been sent down and revealed and so forth. How do we account for these differences? If the Quran is not consistent in its stories, then if we apply the same principle that the Quran asks us to use even balances, just balances, then can we conclude from this that the different accounts in the Quran seem to indicate that this is really the patchwork of human authors, that is, compilers who heard the same story in different ways and they put it together like patchwork and simply stitched all these stories together. These are serious questions that we have to contend with. The evidence is there. I did not invent these texts. I did not write these texts. But I'm using my God-given mind to look at these texts, to analyze them. And when we look at them at a deeper level, we do seem to find some serious objections here. But you see, the case of the Quran, which claims to come down straight from heaven, given through one prophet, one man, to a Arabic-speaking people, does seem to pose a serious problem. And we can understand why the New Testament Gospels are written the way they are and the reason why they do distinguish themselves in terms of the audience. And we can also understand why Muhammad never understood the New Testament. Thank you for joining us. Look forward to seeing you again. Bye for now.